Hello and welcome to Ask Dr. Dobson, Mental Health and Wellbeing Q&A, presented by the Campus Mental Health Strategy and the Faculty of Arts. Next slide, please. The University of Calgary, located in the heart of Southern Alberta, acknowledges and pays tribute to the traditional territories of the people of Treaty 7, which include the Blackfoot Confederacy comprised of the Siksika, the Piikani, and the Kainai First Nations, the Tsuut'ina First Nation, and the Stoney Nakoda, including Chiniki, Bears Paw, and Goodstoney First Nations. The city of Calgary is also home to Métis Nation of Alberta, District 5 and 6. I do want to take a quick bit of time to reflect. Over the past year or so, myself and colleagues were fortunate to gather together with a group of elders from Treaty 7 and Treaty 8 territory, as well as Métis Nation of Alberta. These elders helped inform the renewal of UCalgary sustainability and the campus mental health strategy. It's been wonderful to really get to listen to their stories and learn from their knowledge, experiences, and teachings. One piece that stuck out for me was a teaching about the importance of relationships and well-being. If we're to be well, our relationships have to be well also. The elders talked about this within the context of interpersonal relationships and also with reference to the land. This last piece was an important one. If we don't treat our land and environment with respect and care, our well-being will be negatively impacted as well. This teaching has impacted me personally, and it also influenced our strategy update, which I'll talk a little bit more about in a couple of slides. Next slide, please. So welcome to our webinar. My name is Andrew Zito, and I'm the director of UCalgary's Campus Mental Health Strategy. I'm also a professor in the Department of Psychology at the Faculty of Arts. Today's session, I'll be the moderator and the one asking Dr. Dobson's questions. Today's event is actually one of my favorites, and I'm sure it's yours too as well. This is actually the third installment. We started this during COVID in about 2020 and had follow-up about a year later. But today we're so grateful to have Dr. Dobson back with us for another conversation and another chance to ask your mental health and well-being related questions. So how today will work is that Keith will give a short presentation, maybe 10-15 minutes long. Then we'll move on to some questions that were submitted during participant registration. And finally, we'll have some live audience questions as well. Before we start the webinar, I just want to go over some housekeeping. Please note that this webinar will be recorded and posted after the webinar. As I mentioned, there will be time at the end for lots of Q&A. And we'll do our best to answer as many questions as possible. Feel free to use the Q&A function to ask questions. You don't need to wait until the end of the talk to post your questions. Please use the chat for our opening icebreaker question. So we'll do that when we meet Dr. Dobson. But use the Q&A function to ask your questions. So this, keeping those two things separate will help us organize questions and get through as many questions as we can. Please note that your name display will not appear in the final recording. All microphones and videos are turned off except for Keith's and mine to really ensure that your webinar experience is not disrupted with other images and sounds. Live transcription has also been enabled for this webinar. If you would like to see it, please click live transcript in the Zoom toolbar and then select show subtitles. Finally, again, we'll share the slides with you in an email or something after this, the webinar. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, I'm the director of the Campus Mental Health Strategy. I've been responsible for moving the 28 recommendations forward for quite a while now, since 2016. If you haven't come across our website, please go check it out, ucalgary.ca/mental health. I just want to take this time to give you a short update on the mental health strategy, which we're currently undergoing renewal process. We started in 2021. We've been listening to our UCalgary community about your thoughts on mental health and well-being, especially the last couple of years. Based on the feedback we received from many consultations, engagements, evaluations, data points, and our work with the group of elders I mentioned, we've drafted the new community well-being strategy. From August to December 2023, so just a couple of months ago, we held many engagements and consultations with our campus community, with many groups on campus and members as well. We also sent out a survey to seek feedback on the renewed strategy as well. We've crunched the numbers, we're collating the feedback and further revised the draft strategy based on all the stuff that we received in the past couple of months. We will be bringing the new strategy through the UCalgary governance process starting mid-next month, and we'll formally launch it later in the summer and into fall 2024. You can learn more about our renewal and the draft community wellbeing strategy at ucalgary.ca/mental health/strategy/renewal. Just to give you a quick summary, our strategy will focus on 3 broad themes. Theme 1 is a holistic approach to well-being. We know mental health is important and that continues to be a priority, but we also want to really address other parts as well. Physical health, spiritual well-being, emotional, psychological well-being, mental health, and all these aspects that relate to our well-being. Second, we want to take an upstream focus. We have many services and supports on campus, and we'll continue to prioritize those on our campus. But we also have to move upstream in the sense that we have to do more mental health promotion, illness prevention as well on our campus. And we do want to really shift things also to the upstream. And finally, we want to address or cultivate a supportive academic and workplace culture. We work and study in an achievement-oriented culture and context, and this has led to great things and great heights for UCalgary, right? We have a lot of great research funding. We have a lot of great researchers on campus. We do a lot of great things. I think we can be even more creative, more productive, and innovative if we do this in a caring, supportive campus community as well. I know our provost, Penny Werner, and I have chatted about this quite a bit. Penny mentions that we can both be excellent and caring, supportive, and respectful, right? A sentiment, again, I really do agree with, and I've seen on campus everywhere. And the example that pops up in my head when we talk about this topic is actually our speaker today. Next slide, please. And our next speaker is Dr. Keith Dobson. He is a faculty professor emeritus of clinical psychology and has been at UCalgary for about 35 years. Although he is recently, or well, last year or so, retired, he's still very active, I know, because I do still work with him quite a bit. He is a senior consultant with Mental Health Commission of Canada. He has published, I think, over 400 articles and chapters, published 20 plus books on various topics. You can see that on the slide, the topics that he is really interested in and has done a lot of great research on. In addition to this, I know and many people on our campus share these sentiments. He's a great person, a great supervisor, a great colleague, and a great mentor to many and to myself as well. And last year, if you didn't know, he became an officer of the Order of Canada. So please welcome Dr. Keith Dobson.
Hi, Andrew.
Hi, Keith.
Good to see you again.
Good to see you also. I know you have a presentation for us. But we wanted to do the icebreaker right off the beginning. So here's an icebreaker question that Keith, please, if you can answer, and everybody else in the audience here, if you can insert into your chat. So my icebreaker question is, and somebody actually did ask this, what books are you currently reading, Keith, or book? And what's on your playlist on Spotify, if you have Spotify, or what albums are you listening to?
Okay, so I read fairly broadly. I don't tend to read technical books or history books. I'm more likely going to read novels. The current book I'm reading is one called The Tea Girl of Hummingbird Lane by author Lisa C. And I became interested in that article, or that book rather, because I knew about her writing of a previous book about Jeju Island, which is in South Korea, where I had been. So I read that book, and then I've been following her since. And I've also had the opportunity to travel to China. So it's interesting to see this book about China. Each summer, just as sort of for people's interest, each summer I pick an author who won the Nobel Prize for Literature, and I read all of his or her work in order, and I try to do sort of a biographical history of them to some extent as well. But I read pretty broadly, like I say. In terms of music, I'm not much of an audiophile, I confess. When I work, I tend to use background music, smooth jazz, or oldies, rock and roll, and that's about it. I don't have any particular Spotify account or do anything like that.
Yeah, I know. I share the sentiments. I don't often have time to listen to music. In the car, I do, and if I do listen to music, it's actually a lot of Disney stuff. My daughter, she's 8, so I listen to a lot of that. And I see a lot of people sharing their
Yeah, that's great.
thoughts. So that's great. So that's what an icebreaker is supposed to do. Keith, I'm going to hand it to you to give some
Okay.
presentation, and then we'll come back and answer some questions.
Thank you very much. And the slides I have are just very few, and they're really to sort of set a bit of a context, some key ideas. The slide previous, again, we don't have to go back to it, but it had my email address on it. And one of the things I'll just say right now is that most of my answers today are, of course, going to be general or non-specific to a particular individual. If somebody has a question, though, that you don't feel comfortable asking in the chat, or if you feel like I haven't addressed it fully, please feel free to send me an email. I will respond to all of the emails that I get personally. And I'll do my best, of course, to provide something more personal or specific for your circumstance if that's the case. Few general questions or issues, though, that I wanted to talk about. One is that we're all struggling. We all live in a dynamic, changing, somewhat stressful world. And so, this is just the reality. And I think one of the nice things, if anything, is a nice thing about COVID is that it really brought out the struggles that people are having and the opportunity to talk about mental health concerns. So I think that's wonderful. University of Calgary is actually one of the national leaders, as you know, Andrew, in the field of developing a mental health strategy and really focusing on wellness. So I think we have lots to be proud about, but this is an ongoing development. Generally speaking, when times are worse, our mental health is also worse. So having come out of COVID, I think a lot of people were struggling for a period of time. And in fact, national surveys showed that rates of anxiety, depression, substance use, domestic violence all actually did go up during the pandemic. It does look like rates are coming down somewhat, but we're still struggling and there still are a lot of ongoing issues. So this is important. It's also important to note that most of us generally have a few go-to coping strategies that we use, and they generally work pretty well. So, again, I think we need to give ourselves credit for managing most of the stressors we face. The other key issue, or one of the key issues I wanted to mention, is that, again, there's no single cause for either mental health or mental disorder or struggling mental health problems. The model that I think is the best is something called the biopsychosocial model, which recognizes that there are biological factors that are implicated in our health. There are psychological factors like our beliefs and the way we think about things. And then there are social factors. And by social factors, I mean not just the relationships we have, but also the culture in which we live, the ways we respect and treat each other, and so on. Most of our models of mental health problems focus on risk, like what are the factors that get us into trouble. But one of the nice things I think, again, that we're increasingly focusing on also are what we call resiliency factors. So these are the things that we can do to build our sense of well-being, to prevent ourselves potentially from either having mental health problems or at least not having them be as serious as they might have been otherwise. So today, when we get into the discussion about what can we do, you'll see both this emphasis on de-escalating the problems, but also promoting well-being and health. Also, just as there is no single cause of any given disorder or problem, there's usually no one single treatment either, one way out. Again, what's going to work for an individual is going to vary on their circumstances, on the specific problem they're facing, and so on. And when we get to the level of treatment, so if somebody actually has a mental health disorder, what I usually recommend, and again, this may come through as a theme today, are what I would call evidence-based strategies. So I look for the literature on what has been shown to work, and that's where I go first. Personally, that's what I do, and certainly that's what I recommend. And again, for a given individual, evidence-based strategies often will work, but not necessarily, in which case then, people can start looking at alternatives. And then the final general point I was going to make here is that it's important for all of us to have compassion, both for ourselves and for others. One of the comments I was going to make earlier is that we're all in it together, but really it's about, we're all human. We all face struggles. We all need to support each other. And when we live in an environment like the University of Calgary, whether we're a student, faculty member, or staff, we need to recognize that again, we all need to be there for each other. Next slide. This slide is taken from a program called The Working Mind, and I'll talk about the working mind in just a few seconds again, but it recognizes that mental health is not a single or omnibus construct. It's not like we're either healthy or we're ill. That kind of dichotomous thinking is not that helpful, but rather we're all on a continuum. Some of us are functioning well, and you can see here the green part of this slide talks about markers or signs of potentially healthy functioning, but we might be reacting to a specific circumstance or a particular problem, or the fact that we've been ill, for example, and so we have an issue that we're responding to, and we may show some signs that are in the yellow on this slide. If people struggle further or have ongoing issues, you may talk about injury, like mental health injuries. And again, you may see some more disturbed signs like sleep disturbances, pain, performance issues, and so on. And at the far end, at the right end, we can talk about people who actually meet criteria for mental health disorder. It's been estimated in Canada that approximately 1 in 4 people in a given year will meet the criteria for a mental health disorder, a formal diagnosable condition. But many of us will slide into a disorder and will engage different kinds of coping strategies, and we'll bring ourselves back out. In some cases, of course, we need to speak to our family physician, go to a walk-in clinic, potentially get emergency care, if the problem becomes more crisis-oriented. So we'll talk about that. But this continuum model, I think, is very useful because it recognizes that we're all on the continuum, that our functioning can get worse and can get better. So the double-headed arrow at the bottom is supposed to indicate that. And also that there are different signs and symptoms that we can look at that can be an index of where we are on the continuum. And these include things like our mood, the way we think, our behaviors, whether we're using substances or not. So again, a variety of different sort of markers that we can pay attention to. Next slide. This slide and the next one both talk about some of the coping strategies. So I already said that most of us have a few sort of go-to coping strategies that we tend to use more and more frequently. And again, what this slide does is just introduce the idea that some of these coping strategies are probably more useful at the lower end of the continuum. So things like maintaining a healthy lifestyle, eating well, exercising, dealing with issues at hand, taking small steps to solve problems, taking a breath when we need to, developing our support systems, possibly joining a support group if we don't have enough supports, take time for rest and fun, and having a balanced lifestyle. So these are some of the sort of day-to-day things that I would suggest everybody should be doing. At the other side, as we move up the continuum, things to look at are potentially talking to someone, getting help if necessary, recognizing signs of distress. And again, these vary from person to person. Making self-care a priority, again, making sure that you take care of yourself even if you're feeling more poorly, getting help if you need to, and maintaining social contact. One of the markers, in fact, of a lot of mental health challenges or distress signs is when people withdraw. And so the point you made earlier, Andrew, about social connection is absolutely vital in terms of coping strategies. Next slide. This just simply continues some of the same ideas as at the low end, things like recognizing limits, taking breaks, asking for help if you need it, setting boundaries, balancing your demands, having a balanced work life, for example, identifying if you're starting to shift into unhealthy coping like avoidance or substance use, for example, potentially. Using problem solving. And again, I'll just mention quickly, because this will probably come up a bit later, that in the coping literature, we actually talk about different kinds of problem solving strategies. And generally, we talk about internally focused problem solving. So this is trying to deal with your emotions, trying to deal with, the way that you're thinking about things inside yourself, versus action or externally oriented coping. So problem solving by addressing the issue externally, approaching the issue or the people that are causing distress, and trying to manage the problem that way. Communication, of course, is vital in terms of trying to deal with interpersonal issues especially. And then on the far side, again, following doctor's recommendations if you have any, getting help if people reach out and want to help you, being willing to accept help, recognize that you may not be able to solve the problem on your own potentially. And of course, if you are struggling, either injured or ill, trying to move yourself back to a healthy status as quickly as possible. Okay, so next slide. Just to make a quick comment, those were all the comments I wanted to make in terms of setting up the question and answer period. It is important to note, and there's a few slides here now about supports that we do have at the University of Calgary. So there are student resources. So we certainly have student wellness. Hopefully everybody is aware of it in the MacEwan Student Center. There are workshops and trainings that are available. There also is a dedicated email for students or faculty, for that matter, who recognize a student at risk. So you can actually use the email here to report people that are potentially showing signs of distress. Next slide. There are supports for faculty, staff, and postdocs. They all get the same. There is a mental health consultant available to everyone. People do have access to an employee and family assistance plan, or EVAP plan as they're sometimes called, which again is part of the benefits of working at the University of Calgary. There also are training programs, and this is the Working Mind again. So the University of Calgary did adopt the Working Mind program, which is offered by the Mental Health Commission of Canada, which is a fairly detailed program that talks again about signs and symptoms of distress, stigma related to mental distress or mental illness, and also coping strategies. It's a very good program. It's free. And again, if you're interested, you can use the link here and get more information. Next slide. And then, of course, we have a lot of local and national resources available to us. Some of these are civic, some of these are more provincial, some are national. I'm not going to go through them all, I don't think, in the interest of time, to make sure we have more time for questions. But again, people that are interested in getting access to these services can certainly get the slides later and can potentially look at them. The one I will just mention quickly, though, is a new resource, which not everybody knows about, the 988 number. Most of us know about 911, of course, which is a general emergency number. But 988 is a new dedicated national 24/7 emergency line for people who are in acute crisis and maybe at the point of self-injury. And if people feel like they need immediate access, you can use this number now. So it's one that we're starting to promote. Next slide. And then finally, these are just other community resources. And again, if you want a full list of all of the resources, they're all available at the University of Calgary on the mental health site. So I think that's all I'll say as a background, and maybe we can move to the question and answer period.
Well, thanks for that, Keith. Thanks for talking about resources. I know we do always try to highlight resources. Through a lot of our data points and surveys, we know a lot of our campus community are very aware of the resources that we have on campus and beyond, but there is still a large portion that we don't. So we always like to talk about resources. Keith, so we started this series during COVID. We're a couple of years out now, and you've mentioned people were struggling and are struggling. I think things are getting a little bit better, but a lot of the things that we hear about now is burnout. Burnout is a big question, or a big topic and a buzzword, so to speak, going around. It affects workers in all different sectors. It affects students. We hear it on our campus a lot. Even this past Monday, we had a great workshop addressing burnout for faculty members, led by a couple of faculty members, Kim Johnson and Astrid Kendrick. So we talk about burnout a lot. Tell us what burnout is, because we use that word. But what does a burnout look like? I know there's different conceptualizations and things like that. So what does a burnout look like?
Yeah, I think the best way of thinking about burnout is sort of a generic term for anxiety/depression, low grade. So a person is still functioning, they're still coming to work, for example, they're still able to attend their classes if they're a student, but they're just not functioning at the level that they would want to. They may be having emotional distress, like feeling that they can't cope, or feeling that things are becoming more desperate for them. There's often negative thoughts, again, about inability to manage or potentially in some cases inappropriate demands being put on a person. So external thoughts, blame. And of course, in many cases, there is avoidance or withdrawal, where people feel like they just can't manage, and so they tend to pull away. So again, there are different signs or measures that you can look at for a burnout. There are some existing scales of workplace burnout, but they correlate very highly with measures of anxiety and depression.
So it sounds like then, it's maybe not to the point of excessive anxiety or depression, but again, more maybe lower. I think you mentioned some of the things here, that I've read in the literature, things like decrease in productivity, maybe a cynicism towards what they work and things they found enjoyable before. So I can see things like that. So now that you mentioned burnout and talked about what it is, how do we address it? Whether it be a student who is experiencing a lot of stress, or all these different things having to do as a part of their schoolwork, or somebody who works at the university, or in Calgary. How do we deal with burnout?
Yeah, and again, this goes back to one of the comments I already made about different strategies for coping. So again, there are some more internally focused coping strategies that people can adopt. So things like getting good rest, making sure you're eating well, taking regular exercise if you can, so taking care of yourself as a person, holistic person. I think generally speaking, if you can find some ways to distract yourself so you're not focused on the problems you're dealing with, that can sometimes be helpful for some people. Reconnecting with family, friends, engaging in diversions of one type or another. So those are some possibilities. To me, those are relatively weak, but again, they could be useful for some people. Some of the better strategies, I would argue, in general, would be to try to deal with the source of the burnout itself. So look externally and try to figure out what's going on. So you could ask yourself, for example, what is it about this situation that's causing the burnout? Why am I focused on it so much? Why is it making me so angry or so distressed for whatever reason? And ask yourself, does it need to be this way? So look at your self-talk, look at the things you're saying, and find out if you can address them in some way to minimize or reduce the distress you have. Look at your options. So for example, if you're in a work situation and you feel like the burnout is being put upon you by workplace demands, you can talk to your supervisor or your boss and find out whether or not, in fact, all of the expectations are reasonable or have to be done in this time frame. Because if you feel like you really just can't say no, this is a problem. We all should be able to set limits again and work within the job specifications that we have. You might also think about, if you have that discussion, proposing a solution that works for you. So don't wait for your boss to give you, or your supervisor to give you the solution, but see if you can propose to them something that would meet the demands and would also help you with your burnout. You can certainly seek support. You can talk to your coworkers, you can talk to the resource people that we talked about earlier, and help to problem solve different strategies you could engage in. If it seems like this is a more generic problem, though, like the demands are unreasonable and there's a general consensus that this is unreasonable, I think a confrontation strategy is possible. Again, hopefully it would be done in a respectful way, but talking to the supervisor or the instructor, or whatever the situation is, and seeing whether or not you can, as a group, address the concern and have something done about it. And in the worst case, I suppose some of the strategies would be to think about either a position change or potentially even a job change, or if you're a student, again, stopping taking a course if it's really truly unreasonable. So a variety of strategies.
Yeah, and a lot of the things that you talked about are at the individual level. Now, is there a, so let's think broadly here. Organizations, let's say in the workplace, do they have some role to play in addressing things like burnout or things like that, or what about managers and supervisors? Do they have a role as well?
Absolutely. In fact, I anticipated this question, and I'll just read something if I might. So the Occupational Health and Safety Act of 2020 talks about 3 rights for employees. So this doesn't apply to students, but for the employment situation. The right to refuse dangerous work without fear of reprisal, the right to know about workplace hazards and have access to health and safety information, and the right to participate in health and safety discussions. And one of the specific parts of the Act, it says, and this is a quote, that none of the employer's workers should be subjected to or participate in harassment or violence in the workplace. So again, if we're talking about unreasonable levels of expectation or demands that are not reasonable, you can make an argument that this is a form of inappropriate workplace, and so it causes workplace unsafety or lack of safety in the workplace. And you can potentially make an argument of that type. So the university does have a responsibility, without a doubt. And again, there is recourse if people feel that circumstances are just completely inappropriate and leading to burnout or making an unsafe workplace. Certainly, if anybody's facing incivility in the workplace, you have the right to complain about this either to your supervisor if it's a colleague, or potentially to their supervisor if it's necessary. Hopefully, again, circumstances don't get that far, but they can, of course. Students are in a slightly different situation because often, of course, they feel disempowered if they want to speak to a professor or an instructor about something that they think is unreasonable. But again, they have the right to do that, and they certainly can bring it up either in the first instance with the faculty member who's responsible for a course, or for their supervisor, who's often, of course, the department chair or the program director, depending on the structure. So again, I think we all have to live in a shared environment where we all have to take responsibility for ourselves, and we have to be accountable.
Yeah, and I think you make some good points there. And I think one piece is that, and I think a lot of workplaces are implementing the national standard for psychological health and safety in the workplace, which addresses things like, the things that we're talking about here. We're implementing that here at UCalgary as well. We're also implementing the post-secondary standard, right, for that addresses mental health and well-being for post-secondary students. So these are broader things that organizations can do, right, to address some of these things that we're talking about here today.
Absolutely. And again, I would say UCalgary has been one of the leaders in the country for promoting and adopting these standards. So
that's right. So you mentioned things like distress, negative emotions. We have a lot of questions. I'm wondering about things like that. One piece with burnout is motivation, right? Lack of energy. That seems to pop up quite often for people who are experiencing burnout. What if somebody is uninspired in the work or lacks motivation? How do we raise that motivation and get them to be maybe back to where they're enjoying their work?
Right. So it's a great question. And again, when I hear that question, I go back to this biopsychosocial framework I talked about earlier. So how are we taking care of our bodies? Are we feeding it well? Are we engaging in exercise? Getting appropriate sleep? Again, there's different strategies within each of those domains we could talk about if you want. But basically, are you doing those things so that your body is as resilient and ability to cope with stress as possible? The psychological aspect. What are you saying to yourself? Again, are you being catastrophizing in terms of your thoughts and potentially leading to more distress, or are you having more positive self-talk that can lead to solutions? Are you approaching the problem, or are you avoiding it? Again, I think a lot of people, when they feel distress and burnout, the tendency is to pull away and to shut down, to become more private. And again, for many circumstances, that's actually the wrong strategy in some ways. So again, look at if there's some way you can actually manage or deal with the situation differently in some positive direction. And then the social element, again, generally speaking, not always and not for every situation, but generally speaking, when people are more engaged, they're able to talk to others, they're able to get support from other people, they generally feel better and feel more enthusiastic and more able to cope with problems that they're facing. So again, I would encourage people then to think about, how can they reconnect, either with the people causing the distress, which is ideal, or just in general.
Do you have any thoughts about, this, we talked about this within the context of work, but does this apply to other contexts like your home life?
Absolutely, yeah. There's an approach called acceptance and commitment therapy, which is getting a lot of attention in recent years. And they talk about a key issue being the values that you hold and trying to identify and think about the values. And, again, for one person, it might be a very strong commitment to being socially connected. For somebody else, it might be a value about, engaging in the environment, and doing something to solve issues that they see there. So again, different people have different values, of course, so we need to recognize that. But then the second part is committing yourself to act in a way that's consistent with your values. So again, depending on what those values are, that might lead you in very different directions. But generally speaking, people that are able to act more consistently with the way they think about themselves and think about the world are going to be more satisfied and probably feel better about themselves.
Now, I think those are all good points. But what about, the barrier from, actually getting going, right? To even to getting help or things like that, right? How do we actually make that, cross that threshold?
Yeah, the best strategy that we know in psychology is basically, taking a look at where you are now, and being honest in terms of an assessment of your current functioning, looking at where you want to go and setting some goals, that are reasonable. And again, there's a whole framework for setting goals, and there's different models for doing that. And then picking on the next step. So what is something that's achievable, manageable, measurable, something that you can know that you can do within a reasonable period of time and get some feedback and move that next step. So breaking the bigger problem into smaller steps and then working up that hierarchy. And this is a strategy that's often used in therapy for people that are trying to meet different goals. And it's certainly something that we can do in our own personal lives as well.
That in our discussion about, experiences and emotions, there's a question here about positive, wanting to feel positive emotions, but yet having difficulty doing that, right? How can someone foster feelings of hope, positivity, despite being in despair or in crisis, right? I think we're trying to get into the topic here. What are something somebody can do to get them start getting themselves out of that?
Yeah, so despair and crisis, of course, is at the far end of that continuum I talked about earlier. So that's at the point where I start thinking you might need external resources or support, whether it's a counselor at student services or, an EFAP support or something like that, or even just reaching out to family and friends, and talking about the issues that you're facing. And there's different ways of getting external support. But at a lower level, I guess, what I think about, there are three main psychological drivers for anxiety and distress. One is unpredictability. So if something is potentially going to happen and we don't know when or if or how bad it's going to be, so it's unpredictable in that sense, that's when we start to pay attention to it and focus on it and, potentially obsess about, this issue that's coming down the road. And oftentimes it draws our attention and makes us have kind of a selective focus on that issue, which often is not that helpful because, of course, then we lose perspective and we don't pay attention to ourselves wholly. The second is uncontrollability. So uncontrollability is even if we know that an issue is coming and we can predict it perfectly, if we can't do anything about it, that's when we feel distress as well. So we know, for example, that a family member, is dying and we know that the death is imminent, but we don't know when exactly. We don't know how it's going to happen or impact us. That's the kind of situation, again, I'm talking about. And what we do is we tend to focus on it. We tend to overemphasize the importance of issues like that. And sometimes we try to manage the uncontrollability by exerting more control, like, learning how to cope with it. Sometimes, though, people tend to pull away and become passive or avoidant. And again, as I said earlier, that's generally not recommended. And then the third issue is what we call salience or importance. So obviously, the more important that something is to you, the more likely you're going to pay attention to it, and the more likely you're going to become distressed, if there's an important issue in your life. So these are the three psychological drivers. So how do you then manage it? Well, in terms of predictability, what you can do is try to get good information, so find out about the problem you're thinking about, don't ask I don't want to say, I was going to say, don't ask your family member, about their opinion, but, try to get good information if you can from an expert or a good source. Learn new coping strategies if you need to, or engage the coping strategies that you often use if you need to exert more control. And really ask yourself again about how important is this to you? Is this something you really need to be distressed about? Or see if you can, in some ways, perhaps de-escalate some of your self-talk. So those would be a few strategies.
So that's great. But I'm gonna ask you to elaborate a little bit more.
Sure.
I'll give you a specific context. And
Okay.
maybe you can address it within the three things that you said here. Let's say I know you work mainly with adults, but let's say we have a child who is afraid of fire alarms at school. How do we and the child may keep thinking about it and worried and anxious over it and don't want to go to school, for example. So how would you address that, using kind of things that you discussed?
Well, you're talking about a specific fear, like a fear of fire alarms. So, and there actually is a prescribed evidence-based intervention for that work called exposure therapy. So there actually is a treatment model that's been developed for specific fears, and it deals with all of these elements. It deals with the unpredictability. So it recognizes that these things can happen spontaneously. You often would help children in a situation like that to be exposed to random noises, so that they can learn to startle, but then calm themselves. So you teach them some coping strategies to manage that. You deal with the controllability issue by recognizing that the sounds may occur, that things may happen around you, but you don't necessarily have to respond. Again, that there are certain things that you should do and certain things you don't need to do. So part of the control response in that case, of course, is looking for leaders, teachers in the school situation who will tell you whether or not you need to do something. So if the alarm goes off, of course, generally speaking, the class gets up and assembles and goes out into a safe place. So managing that. And part of that is looking at the thoughts as well. Again, how important is this? Is it a real crisis? Is it going to cause death or injury? Right? So all of those kinds of things. Again, part of the problem we have, I think, as beings, is that life is to some extent unpredictable and uncontrollable. And so the best that we can do is often recognize that, be tolerant as much as we can, be compassionate, again, like I said earlier, towards ourselves and towards others, recognizing imperfection, and develop our coping skills as best we can.
So, I think you raised a very important point there. A lot of things that we experience, especially now, are, uncontrollable, unpredictable. There's lots of things going on in the world. We might tend to think about these things that are happening in the world with excessive anxiety or worry, or keep thinking about it, right? How do we manage all these different things that are happening around us that we don't have control, right? Any thoughts on that specifically?
Well, again, I think it's a matter of getting good information, like finding out what is predictable, what's not predictable, what is controllable, what's not controllable. Recognizing that to some extent we don't know everything. That life is somewhat unpredictable, uncontrollable. Learning some effective coping strategies to manage the responses we have. So, for example, some people practice deep breathing, some people use meditation, some people use a variety of sort of self-calming instructions. So again, there's different ways that you can deal with the internal signs and symptoms that you have. And part of it then is thinking about what can you control and then taking appropriate steps. So for example, I know one of the questions that came in the chat before was about eco-anxiety, or anxiety about the environment. And one of the things you could do in that area is, if you really feel passionate and you feel that this is an area that's important to you, and again, your values, going back to that issue, are that you should do something, then take some personal steps. So that could include things like recycling, which again, I know that's been somewhat denigrated of late as not very important, but it is important. So taking personal steps that we can. Potentially getting out and enjoying nature, for example, with respect to eco-anxiety, potentially joining an environmental group, or even getting political, becoming a political agent to try to address these issues. So there are different levels of intensity of response. Again, they don't perfectly control the environment. Obviously, none of those does, but it helps you at least then to feel that you're living your life in a way that's consistent with your values.
Right. So it's maybe channeling your energy into different aspects to really support. Now,
Yeah.
I'm going to ask you your thoughts on this. Especially with things that are happening around in the world. Do you think social media has a part to play in that and in increasing our anxiety and worry, because we have such access to events that happen in the world? We have so much information coming on. Do you think social media plays a role in this, compared to even, 20 years ago, right? Or 10 years ago even.
Yes. My personal opinion is yes, it does, without a doubt. Do I have data to support that? No, I don't. So again, just to be very clear that that's not an evidence-based comment. But of course, this has been debated and discussed a lot in the literature, by various authors about, to what effect does social media have. And I think that there are two elements in particular. One is that social media tends to make things more immediate. So we get our feed, we get the text messages, instantaneously almost when something happens around the world. And so it tends to highlight things that maybe aren't that important to us, frankly, that we don't need to pay as much attention to day by day. So it increases our level of anxiety and stress. And the truth is media does that. In fact, part of the way that they sell and make money is by increasing the feed and increasing your anxiety so that you tend to go back and look for more information. So, and again, that's that predictability aspect. They prey on our desire for predictability or information. So that's part of it. The other part of it, I think, that really is the most distressing for me in some ways about social media is the quality of the information. And again, this has been talked about by media organizations. A lot of this information is really no better than asking your aunt or uncle their opinion. And so again, when I think about going to get information, I don't go to social media. I do go to the news sources like CBC or BBC, to try to get more quality information. And again, that's not always possible. So again, I think it's natural that people go to the sources that they have and that are easy, but the quality of that data is not always very good.
I want to ask you a related question from a member of the audience. Let's say a teenager, for example, is experiencing anxiety or worry over, eco-anxiety or matters related to world events. How can, a parent distinguish between that and maybe somebody who is experiencing depression or a general anxiety disorder or some type of mental illness?
Well, and they may go together. In fact, so a person may have both anxiety and depression. And in fact, amongst all of the mental disorders, those are the two most commonly comorbid, as we talk about them, but co-occurring. So people may well have both signs. There are existing measures, of course, of anxiety, depression, and eco-anxiety even. So one option would be to get to an expert and get a formal assessment done. But I think more easily, obviously, you can ask the youth, ask them about what are you thinking, what are you feeling, what's your concern, and again, start getting them to think about what is a realistic thing that they can understand, where are they getting their sources of information again, because I think that's a real concern, especially for youth these days, is that a lot of the information is not good quality information. So ask them about that, potentially get them involved then in the better sources of information, get them to talk to you, like if you're the parent or caregiver, to get them to express their concerns, and then see whether or not, again, you can direct them towards more healthy lifestyle and potentially taking action, like I was saying earlier, getting involved in organizations, taking personal steps, controlling what you can.
So related to this, we talked about this in the parent context a couple of times. At the university in Calgary, a lot of us work in helper positions or even just as peers, right? We see people who may be experiencing problems. How do we if we see something with somebody, how do we whether it's a loved one or a coworker or a peer, how do we get them help, or how do we support them?
Yeah, so this is a difficult situation because, of course, you may see somebody who is in distress and probably or might benefit from some kind of support, but for whatever reason they're not taking those steps, or maybe they don't recognize their own level of distress. So one of the first things I would say in a situation like that is to first think for yourself about what is your position. So are you in a position of authority? So for example, if you're a manager and you see somebody who works in your unit who's in distress, you do have some authority and you do have some responsibility for the individual and for the organization at large. If you're a parent, obviously you have responsibility, and probably, would be expected to take some action. If it's a family member, there's probably more of a moral obligation to do something to help them to take some steps. But if it's a friend, you may feel like it's not your place, or you're not sure about your place. So first think about your situation and what you want to push and how far you feel like you want to go. So that's one thing. Second thing is, I would encourage you first to think about the resources that are available, not just from yourself, but also within the organization. So for example, you might print off the information page about resources at the University of Calgary if you're talking to a student or talking to a colleague at the university, so that you have that resource available that you can engage. Then what you want to do is think about, what is it that you're seeing? What, again, not your inference, so not that your suspicion that the person has a drinking problem, for example, but what are you seeing directly? So what behaviors, what is the person saying, what are they doing, or what are they not doing? And again, this can be tricky because sometimes it's not that they're necessarily doing something that's distressing, but maybe they're avoiding, again, or pulling back. So it's the lack of action, or something like that. But look for the change. Basically, look for the behavioral changes, or the things that you see that the person is not doing that they used to be doing, or is doing that they weren't doing before, as the case may be. And then approach them when you feel ready, and you've got your information and you've thought about your position. Approach them, usually in a confidential way. So if you can find a private space or some quiet space, where you can speak to them. You might even set an appointment time with them, where you can talk to them where others aren't around. Tell them what you've seen, and again, be as behavioral or as concrete as you can, so that it's not confrontational, but it's clear and direct. Tell them your concern. Let them know that you think this is a concern, that you would like to help, and then offer your resources. And again, depending on the circumstance, it might be just simply you providing the emotional support. That may be sufficient. It might be you talking to the employer together, or the manager together, if it's a work-related situation. It might be encouraging them to take action by using some of the university resources, calling their family doctor, getting emergency care. Again, the situation will obviously vary from case to case. But basically have that list of resources available so that you can engage in them and help the person to get the resources that are going to help them. And then the last thing I would say as a piece of advice is don't do it once and walk away, but check back, and tell the person, having taken the step, that you are going to check back and see how they're doing. And make sure that that they know that you're going to follow their circumstance, unless they tell you absolutely to step away. And again, that can happen, where people can reject your offer of support. But again, just let them know that you're there, that you're ready and you're willing and you're able to provide support.
Now, I can see this for myself, supporting a loved one, or, even a peer, right? What about if you're in a kind of a hierarchical relationship, right? A supervisor or a manager, right?
Mm-hmm.
Can I, as a manager or supervisor, speak with an employee like that? Or what about the other way around? As
Yeah.
an employee, can I see this? Because
Yeah, if you are a manager, I would say not only can you, but you probably should take that step, and not just for the sake of the person who's working within your organization, or you're part of the organization, but for those around them. Because if you're seeing things that are causing you concern, chances are other people around them are also feeling that. And so absolutely, as a manager, you have the right, and I would say responsibility, again, to step forward and say something in a confidential, caring way. Again, you're not their therapist, so that you don't want to confuse those roles, but within the limits of what you can do, provide support and resources. So that one I think is relatively easy. The harder one is if you're an employee and you see somebody who's distressed, who you work for, so you're a supervisor or your manager is potentially having problems. That's one where, again, I think you certainly can speak to them depending on your relationship. And you could potentially speak to colleagues and approach the manager as a group, although again, you want to be careful that you're not engaging in gossip or creating a negative environment. But again, if the focus is on providing resources, you could certainly do that. Theoretically, if you think that would be stressful, and again, potentially hazardous to you in your working relationship, you could go to their supervisor. But again, I would say in most cases, if we can, we should address the person directly.
Yeah, and I think on at UCalgary here we have a wonderful resource, the mental health consultant, Amanda Habiak, and she really supports people on our campus to really if they suspect somebody is experiencing distress or in crisis, she can help support you in
Yeah.
supporting that person, right? So there are resources here on campus.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But again, in my own personal history, I've been a department head, and I've had conversations with faculty members who are showing signs of distress in the workplace. And again, I would always do that in a confidential manner, offering resources, and then follow up, like I said.
So let's think about so we talked about supporting somebody who you think might be in distress. What if somebody is coming back to work? There's some questions here related to coming back to work. We want to be supportive, but I think maybe in situations people don't know how to be or are not supportive.
Mm-hmm.
How do we support somebody who comes back?
Yeah, it's been often said that if somebody develops cancer, for example, or a chronic illness and has to take a leave, disability leave for a period of time, they get flowers and they have a party, and when they come back to work, everybody is, "How are you doing?" And if somebody leaves for mental health reasons, nobody talks the word about it. The person is sort of persona non grata, and when they come back, nobody knows how to address them. So again, I think for people that are in leadership roles, a good thing to do is to have a discussion with colleagues. And again, privacy rules means you can't talk about all of the circumstances, but talk about the fact that this person is coming back to work, to set as possible, or positive rather, in an environment as you can as possible, to meet directly with the worker when they come back to work, and to encourage them to express their concerns and the need for help that they may continue to have. Many people who come back to work for mental health reasons, feel isolated, feel that they don't know who they can speak to. So the more co-workers who can and are willing to go up to and speak to that person, let them know that they're welcome back, that you want to work with them, and engage them again in social activities, the better.
So from the perspective of the employee returning to work, do you have any suggestions for what if somebody is still maybe returning to work in the transition and maybe not feeling up to themselves, and maybe they feel they can't handle the situation, they've sought help. What are some things that you might recommend a person who's in that situation?
Yeah, so you're talking about the worker themselves who's
Yes,
returning.
that's right.
Yeah. I mean, again, I think we all need to be open and honest with ourselves about how we're doing and our level of functioning. And anytime somebody feels that they can't manage their workload, hopefully they would be able to speak to their manager and talk about what accommodations or changes might be necessary, or whether or not again a leave is indicated, or a change of work responsibilities. Again, there's a variety of things that can be done within a large organization like the university. But again, hopefully we all feel okay about ourselves, that we can say, I'm struggling, I'm having some stress, or I'm having some mental health risks or challenges. Again, if people use the continuum model, you could say I'm going into the orange, or I feel like my functioning is not what it should be, and to be able to have an open and frank conversation about that. That's risky, of course. And again, we do know, and I know you and I do work in this area, that there is workplace stigma still, unfortunately, that, it is risky in some settings to talk about your mental health challenges. But over time, I would hope that we would be able to have those conversations more openly and honestly. Just like if we had a back injury, and we said we couldn't do certain work in the motor pool, that we'd be able to have the same conversation that, right now I'm feeling kind of depressed because, whatever circumstance, and I need some kind of accommodation.
Yeah, I think, within the university, we have a lot of great champions and leaders who are willing to speak, about their experiences, great faculty members, staff members, leaders who are willing to, chat about their experiences, to talk about, seeking help and things like that. So I think that does do a lot of great deal of good in the workplace. And hopefully we can continue to do more of that with the campus mental health strategy. Now let's switch gears a little bit. You know, we talked about one aspect of coming out of the pandemic, you know, burnout, things like that related to that. Another thing that I've noticed coming out of the pandemic or during the pandemic, you know, there's a lot of social isolation.
Yes.
Loneliness is becoming a very, very important topic. Did you know that actually the World Health Organization
Yes.
announced a new commission on social connection
Yep.
that addresses loneliness? What are your thoughts on this and then specifically social connection and its impact on mental health? And then how do we address loneliness, right? So I just wanted to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, so we've known in the psychological literature for a long time that loneliness is a major driver of mental health problems, and vice versa, that mental health problems tend to drive loneliness because, like I said earlier, people tend to pull away or isolate sometimes when they feel badly about themselves. And the UK, for example, the United Kingdom or the government of England now has a minister of loneliness, so they've addressed this issue. But this has been known for a long time. In fact, there was a long-standing study that was done in England, London, England, and they called it the Befriending Program. And it was a treatment intervention for depressed women. And the intervention consisted of nothing more than having an identified friend, quote unquote, who came by and made contact with the depressed women. And that treatment, and if you want to call it a treatment, was as effective as anything else that was done for people with depression. So we know it's a significant issue. There also was a study done in Spain at the beginning of the pandemic, and it was very foresightful of the people there. What they did is they randomly assigned students when the university went into lockdown to either have ongoing contact, like prescribed contact, and it was either phone or email contact with identified people, or not. And again, the other people could have had social contact or not, but basically either there was prescribed contact or just sort of as usual. And not surprisingly, the group that had the prescribed contact had significantly lower levels of depression when they went back and checked 3 months later. So we know that reducing loneliness is a preventive factor for reducing rates of depression. So again, this is not news. What can we do about it, though, I think is the challenge. Because, of course, during the pandemic, we were all encouraged to isolate or be physically distant from each other. One of the things I said many times, and I don't know if I ever said this directly to you, Andrew, but I know I did in many cases, but saying that we should never, ever have talked about social distancing as a strategy for COVID. I think that was a mistake in our language. What we should have talked about was physical distancing. Because yes, in order to reduce the risk of spread of the virus, physical distance made sense and protections made sense. But social distance wasn't the issue. What we should have always been doing, and in fact, if anything, increasing, was the amount of contact we had, whether it was phone contact, email contact, Zoom meetings, whatever, it doesn't really matter. But some kind of social contact was critical. So again, in general, what I would say for people is that if you find that you're in a situation where you're starting to withdraw or feel like you can't manage social circumstances or social situations, or if you're being encouraged to pull away because of viruses, resist. Really look for opportunities for finding people that are compatible with yourselves. Could be past friends, family members, people maybe you haven't connected with for a while. Identify them and find some way to reconnect. So think about who those people are and engage in those things. Other people who are lonely, again, people can have different reasons for loneliness, of course, but if you find yourself feeling like you need more connection, think about those activities that would give you a sense of purpose or a sense of connection. It could be volunteering, it could be community gardens in the summer. There's a whole bunch of clubs around. The university, again, is excellent in terms of having the student clubs that are available. So giving a sense, again, of connection that way. Potentially try something new, do something you've never done before as a way of, again, engaging in social connection. So think about it. One of the things I've seen, which I don't strongly recommend personally, but again, I've heard it can be useful for loneliness, is pets, or having not pets, but a pet, having a pet. So again, that can be a strategy. A little bit of a risk there, I would say. Right now, there's actually an excess of pets that are being surrendered after COVID-19 restrictions have been lifted. So again, only take on a pet if you feel like you have the resources and the staying power to maintain and take care of it, of course. But again, a variety of strategies there.
So let's talk about maybe some specific things to the workplace. What is something that I can do, let's say as a manager or as a supervisor, or even coworkers to get, us to connect more socially? Are there tips or ideas that you have about that?
I've been a strong advocate for workplaces getting people back into the workplace as much as possible. And I know that a lot of employees don't like that because they enjoy working at home or having blended work circumstances. But I think, in terms of social engagement and to combat loneliness, having people physically present is absolutely the thing that we need to do. And so, I would encourage that as much as possible from a mental health perspective. Again, it may not affect the workplace output as much. And I think that if people are in the workplace and physically present, you start to see then more spontaneous social contact. So, at the water cooler, so to speak, not that I've seen any water coolers lately, but around the coffee shop, people will talk, and you start to learn more about things that are going on in their personal lives, and you just get a better sense of people overall. You feel a stronger sense of commitment. If you're a manager, I think one of the things you can do is facilitate social engagement. So have physical parties again, where people get together. If you're a department head, make sure that you have physical department meetings, where people again are encouraged to be there present, physically present. I'm on campus right now, and I'm still struck, even though we're, supposedly post-pandemic, about how quiet the hallways are. So again, I think a lot of people still haven't taken the opportunity to come back to campus in ways that I think would be more useful.
Yeah, I think, actually the other day I heard something that quite interesting, as a way to take a break. They, it was an organization downtown. One of the managers gathered their friends to go to, a nearby grocery store that sold, different various products, right? To just
Perfect.
get out and, right. I think, it's both taking a break, but yet you get that connection, right, with your employees, your coworkers to spend some time together, right?
Yeah, exactly. I've spoken to a number of my colleagues who feel quite disengaged, and again, part of that is that they themselves aren't making the effort to come and to be here physically on campus. That is. So again, I think to the extent we can encourage people to be physically present, the better.
Yeah, and I agree. I even sometimes I feel that it's comfortable staying at home and in my comfy clothes and my sweatpants and taking calls on Zoom, right?
Yep. Yeah,
So
no,
so
I agree. I mean, I do it myself too. I mean, I work from home. And again, during COVID, of course, we were all encouraged to stay away. So we've all set up, well, not all of us, but many of us have set up very effective workplaces in the home. So, it makes it easier to stay away. But again, I think that comes at a psychological cost.
um so really thinking about some different coping strategies. Couple of questions I've mentioned physical health. I'm in the office. I see you in the office. I know you go to the gym a lot. I know you. We used to play ball together for a while. You go cross country skiing. What's the importance of physical health and mental health? In a lot of our society here in Western culture, we tend to compartmentalize, physical health, mental health as separate things. But as a psychologist, I'm going to push you a little bit here. In our Western thinking, we talk specifically about mental health. But what do you think about mental health? Does that have an impact on, or physical health have an impact on mental health? Again, looking at yourself, you do a lot of activities. What's your thoughts
Yep.
on that?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, absolutely. Again, I go back to the comment I made earlier about the biopsychosocial framework. And we are biological, psychological, and social animals. And, if we ignore any of those elements, and again, in the broadest possible way of thinking about them, we're likely going to cause distress in the other areas, because there's always feedback. So if we're sleeping poorly, if we're eating poorly, that's going to cause increased stress on our bodies, and it's going to cause increased likelihood that we're going to feel badly. We're going to function less well. We're going to watch what we do and see that we're not functioning as well and become more self-critical. And again, there's always feedback loops. We know that. It's interesting watching the psychological research literature grow over the last 30 years or so about how more complex our models are and how more integrative they tend to be, because we recognize again that there are all of these feedback loops. So yeah, there is no health without mental health. That's been said before. But the same is true otherwise too. There's no health without biological health, physical health, or social health, well-being.
Yeah, so it's really thinking about the holistic approach to.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah, as much as possible. General recommendations, if you want, you should have approximately 3 or more times a week where you engage in 30 minutes or more activity where your heart rate is increased. So that could be some kind of aerobic exercise, could be walking, skating. Again, there's many different activities depending on what the person is interested in doing, but something aerobic, and then at least twice a week, and more likely 3 times a week, with some kind of weight or resistance training. That's probably optimal guidelines, but again, more is better.
What about
especially if it's in a group, like cross-country skiing.
Right, and I know you lead a group doing that for many years, but I must say, I don't have time for that. I have all these things to take care of. I have work to do. Then I go home, I have to make dinner, and I have to take care of my kids, and that that's something that I say to myself as well.
That's a challenge for sure, without a doubt. And again, people are going to vary in terms of their resources, in terms of their time, and in terms of opportunities. Again, the university is fantastic. We have lots of good resources, so they are available. I do see people at the gym regularly who I know come from their workplace, and they go over there at the lunch hour. So you can do that, even while you're at work, if it doesn't impact your home life. But you're right, absolutely. People have various stresses and demands on themselves, so we all have to figure out what's going to work for us. Convenience is a big issue. If you decide that you're going to engage in, again, cross-country skiing up in the mountains, that's time and energy and money, and again, those may not be reasonable. So again, you have to think about something again that works for your lifestyle. Walking, again, a 30-minute walk, most of us can manage that, I think.
Yeah, and again, I think part of it is what you're alluding to is prioritizing these things and really embedding them within your life as well, right?
Yeah.
Again, whether it be work, go out with, have a walking meeting, for example, right?
Well, one of the things that I will say is that in my calendar, my electronic calendar, I actually put in my exercise activities. So I, in fact, in my calendar, right after this meeting, it says go to the gym. So when we hang up, I'll be going to the gym. But again, it doesn't mean I go right at that minute, for a certain way, but I know that by putting it in my calendar, I've prioritized it, and I probably will get there.
So now you say that, I'm going to check on you.
Okay.
After this.
I've got my bag sitting right over here. As soon as we hang up, I'm going down the hall.
I know you do. So we have about 15 minutes left. Well, I know we have some more specific questions. Maybe we can address some of these specific questions that maybe not broaching some of the topics that we've discussed already. There's a question on ACEs. I know that's been a topic of discussion for a lot of people more recently. It's been a topic. I know you've done some work with ACEs. Maybe you can tell people what ACEs are and
Sure.
what the research related to that.
Sure. So ACEs is an acronym. It stands for Adverse Childhood Experiences. And it's a concept that's really only been around for about the last 24 years or so, 25 years. The landmark study that most people think about was done in California. It was published in 1998 by Felitti and colleagues. And they talked about this concept of adverse childhood experiences as sort of a cumulative stress that then can lead to long-term disadvantage or disability potentially. What they developed was a scale that measured the number of adverse childhood experiences people have. And today, what we often do is we use a short form, which counts 10 different types of adverse childhood experiences. And they fall into three broad categories. One is adversity, generally speaking. So living in a family that was divided, like where the parents separated, living in a family where one of the people struggled with substance use, for example. Neglect experiences is another category, and then abuse, actual physical, emotional, different kinds of abuse patterns. So anyway, you can count up the number of those different kinds of experiences before age 18, and then you can correlate or relate the number of adverse childhood experiences with adult health. And the global pattern, and this has been now shown in many different studies, including the biggest study done in Canada, which was done here in Calgary, is that the more ACEs you have, the worse your adult health is going to be. And that is true for mental health and physical health. So people are more likely to have chronic disease if they have increased adverse childhood experiences as well.
There's a question about chronic illness, or maybe more than one question about chronic. How do you manage that? When you stay mentally resilient, when you're experiencing chronic illnesses.
Well, again, we know that there's an association. So for example, we know that people with depression and chronic illness, or like chronic pain in particular, the likelihood of the chronic pain lasting longer and being more severe is increased. So again, these tend to feed on each other, or have a reciprocal relationship. If it's a condition that the person has a chronic illness and that can be treated, of course, that's different than if it's a chronic illness that is untreatable, like something like chronic pain or Crohn's disease, or some illness that can be managed but not treated. So again, if you're in the workplace situation, I think the key is for the manager to be made aware, especially if there's a need for any accommodations or workplace adjustments. At the very least, again, recognizing and being able to tell yourself that this is the reality, so that you're going to need to manage both circumstances. It will be more challenging, no doubt, than if you have either the chronic health condition or a mental health problem independently, having that comorbid or combined condition. And then adjust, and again, if it's a health condition, obviously trying to best meet your medical recommendations or your physician advice. So that'd be some of the things I would think about.
Yeah, thanks for that. We have a specific question about emotional regulation.
Mm-hmm.
This person's finding it difficult to stay calm and react rationally in a very stressful situation. I know what I was expected to react, but my body just freezes, and sometimes because of big emotions, anger or concern, frustration. Could you please advise on how to regain calmness when feeling stressed and to regulate emotions?
Okay, so they talked about the word freezing. So one of my immediate associations, of course, is the stress response called the fight, flight, or freeze response. So, again, this has been recognized as a general pattern that when people face adversity or have some stressful event that occurs to them, they tend to engage in one of three responses. Fight, which is to oppose or resist whatever the issue is, or the person or the situation. Flight, which of course is to escape, run away or not go into that circumstance, or freeze, which is another kind of avoidance, another sort of avoidant pattern. But you stay in the situation, but you just don't respond. And again, these are coping strategies that people learn, and again, often become habitual. So the person, again, who's engaging in freezing as a typical pattern. So one of the things I would say is, first, what is the circumstance, and trying to understand a bit more about that. And again, we don't have that information right now, but I'd want to know if it's a situation where another response is possible. So for example, could you resist or fight, in that situation, whatever the stressor is. If so, then possibly learning new coping strategies to manage and deal with the stressor more directly. I said earlier that avoidant coping, or passive coping, generally speaking, is seen as less productive than active coping or problem-solving coping. So again, what I would want to do in a case like this is understand a bit more about the circumstance, why the person feels that they have to freeze, what do they do when they freeze, to learn possibly some new ways to think and feel, in response to whatever the challenge is, and then to learn some new coping strategies to confront or approach that person. If this has become a real pattern, I would say that, again, this might be somebody who would benefit from getting some coaching or some kind of support, mental health support.
A question about imposter syndrome and related to that.
Mhm.
You know, as faculty members, we have lots of people doing great things.
Yep.
You know, you might feel not up to it. You know, even as a grad student, I felt that myself. You know, for example, there's a lack of faculty positions out there. How do we, think that we're not a failure? How do we, get through some of those feelings of inadequacy?
Yeah, that's a tricky one in the moment because, of course, usually there's some evidence or some, something that the person is looking at that leads them to this conclusion that maybe they are an imposter, maybe they're not as good as other people might think about themselves. This is one where in the short term, there's not much you can do, I don't think, except look at yourself, the evidence. You could potentially talk to your supervisor, manager, postdoc supervisor, or doctoral supervisor, if that's the circumstance, and get some kind of more balanced, independent evaluation. But this is one in the longer term where I think, you basically have to tough it out to some extent and find out in the long term if you can actually prove your value. This syndrome, the imposter syndrome, is not at all rare. Many of us have it. I had it myself for a period of time, and learning how to manage it, is an important thing to do. I'll just give a personal example here. When I was my first year of instructing, I was on faculty at UBC at the time. I remember that I had the personal thought was that if a student asked me a question in class, I had to know right then and there what the answer was. And if I didn't, this would show that I really didn't know my stuff. And I recognized this thought pattern, and I recognized that I was putting in more pressure on myself than I needed to. And so I made the decision that even if the student asked me a question and I knew the answer, I was going to say I didn't know. I would just tell them I didn't know, but that I would get back to them. I'd go find the information and I'd get back to them. And of course, what I would do in the next class or the next couple of classes is I would give the information or answers. But it was a way of proving to myself that I didn't need to know everything all the time, and it was okay to be less than perfect, or less than adequate all the time. And that was helpful for me, I know, as an instructor. So that's one
No,
example.
and thank you for sharing that. We see a lot of reactions giving you lots of thumbs up and hearts. Maybe you can give maybe a little bit of assessment of the situation. So it's a specific question. Sometimes mental health issues can have dominant effect or a domino effect when
Yes.
depend on your work. For example, if an instructor needs to have a mental health leave partway through the semester, this can have adverse impact on their students. This creates a dilemma between the instructor pushing through and sacrificing their own mental health and well-being to create more stability for the students, or take a leave and make the situation more difficult for students. So do you have any strategies for the situation or thoughts that maybe can help this? It might be a tough one, eh?
Yeah, that's a tricky one. I'll harken back to one of the things that you said earlier about the revised mental health strategy and the focus more on upstream kinds of activities. So, which is more prevention, of course, focusing on, trying not to get into these circumstances. So, if you're an instructor and you start to see something happening in the class, either, from yourself or the students engaging in something, the earlier you can identify it and manage it, the better. So that's sort of a given. And that's true in health generally. There's been a real push towards early identification, early intervention across the board. So I would say that. Beyond that, I guess it would depend again on the circumstances. So, if you see that you're doing something as an instructor and you know that it doesn't feel quite right, again, I guess I would encourage you first to be honest with yourself, to look at what you're saying to yourself, the feelings you're having, what is the behavior, look at the pattern and see if you can do something to modify it. But you're absolutely right. Whoever asked the question is absolutely right that if you start to engage in ways that are incivil or inappropriate or causing stress, chances are the students will pick up on that and will pull away or start to engage in ways that are disturbed, which again, as an instructor, you're likely going to see, and you can get into a vicious kind of a cycle. So the quicker you can identify those patterns and manage them, the better.
Keith, it's been great, listening to all your answers. do you have any final thoughts for, our audience here? Majority of them have stayed and they've loved hearing you. So do you have any final thoughts that you may want to leave with our audience?
Yeah, no, I mean, again, I've already said some of these things about the importance of being kind to ourselves, being kind to others, paying attention to yourself, doing self-monitoring, reaching out for support from others, family, friends, mental health experts if necessary. But basically taking care of yourself as a holistic person.
So Keith, thank you so much for joining us. We are thankful also for everybody who joined and stayed. We had hundreds of participants and many great questions. Given the webinar format, we couldn't answer any questions. I know, Keith, you put up your email and offered to address specific questions if people couldn't or if their questions weren't answered. Again, all your questions were really great. We have supports as well. And if there's additional questions, feel free to email Keith as well. We have resources available, which we'll send out via our mail out with the slides. And finally, if you have any questions specifically related to the mental health strategy, we have a specific email that can address that. So mhstrategy@ucalgary.ca, and we can answer any questions related to strategy or anything related to some resources on campus. So again, I want to thank you, Keith, one more time. Thank you for doing this the third time. I really enjoyed the series, and I know our audience does too. And have a great day, everybody. Keith, get that exercise in, get the gym time in, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity.